In 1988, on the 300th anniversary of Newton's Principia, Pope St. John Paul II published a letter to Father George Coyne, who was the then head of the Vatican Observatory. And in this letter, he called for what he calls a dynamic interchange based on critical openness between faith and science, and here particularly Roman Catholic faith and science. Now, in talking about this dynamic interchange and this critical openness, he gives us the following caution. Quote, "In the process, we must overcome every regressive tendency to a unilateral reductionism, reducing science to faith, faith to science, to fear, and to self-imposed isolation." What I want to talk to you about this morning is a possible fear that would stand in the way to this project of a dynamic interchange and a critical openness between faith and science. The fear is essentially this, that if I can explain certain phenomena in terms of creatures or of nature, then by that very fact, there is no room left for what we would call divine action or the causality of God. Or on the other hand, if I can explain or choose to explain something in terms of divine causality, that leaves no room for any explanation in terms of creaturely or natural causality. You might put it this way. If God does it, nature doesn't do it. If nature does it, then God doesn't do it. This can take a couple of different forms. One form is expressed by Richard Lewontin, that we must protect what he called naturalism at all cost, lest we let a divine foot in the door. Well, I'm not talking about that today. There was another tendency, and it's among those usually of religious commitments or temperament, or who want to protect or hold a religious view of the world. It'll be the same mistake, but in reverse. My example here is from a very religious man, Al-Ghazali. He was an 11th century Persian philosopher and mainly theologian. In his book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, he writes the following. The text is dense, but that's why they call me Coach. I will explain it to you. He says, quote, "The connection between what is habitually believed to be a cause and what is habitually believed to be an effect is not necessary according to us. But with any two things, where this is not that and that is not this, and where neither the affirmation of one entails, logically, the affirmation of the other, nor the negation of one entails, logically, the negation of the other. It is not a necessity of the existence of the one that the other should exist, and it is not a necessity of the non-existence of the one that the other should not exist. For example, thankfully, the quenching of thirst and drinking, satiety and eating, burning and contact with fire, and so on to include all that is observable among connected things. Their connection, he means their causal connection, is due to the prior decree of God who creates them side by side, not to its being necessary in itself, incapable of separation." So what's going on here? Al-Ghazali's making the following point. From the standpoint of logic, fire, heating, and being burned may be apparently connected in the world, but there is no logical contradiction of affirming one and denying the other. And if this is the case, could it not be that on the occasion, fire becomes contiguous with a pot of water? God directly makes the water boil and not the fire. It only appears that fire and heat have causal power. Now, this view is called occasionalism. On the occasion, the two things come into contact. God directly intervenes in a way you and I might model as a miracle. Now, Al-Ghazali holds this because he has a deep fear among some of his compatriots, fellow Persian philosophers. The first one comes to mind is a philosopher named Al-Farabi, who tended to want to talk and model nature along the lines of Aristotle and talk about nature and explain nature in terms of natural causes, which seemed to Al-Ghazali to leave no room for divine action. By the way, this kind of thinking seems to me to color much, I won't say all because I haven't seen all, but much of so-called intelligent design argumentation, which sees the divine and the created as competing causes. So what I'm going to do today is the following. I'm not going to try to defeat occasionalism. That's actually very difficult. I'll offer you an alternative view, which in my view is the best our tradition has to offer in modeling the relation between the creator and the creature. And it'll be primary and secondary causality in St. Thomas. So the talk will proceed in the following way. First, we'll talk about, according to St. Thomas, what God does, then what creatures do, then how what God does and creatures do relate, and then we will talk about how order and chance, according to him, would fit into this model. So first, well, what does God do? Shocker, everything. But God does everything but what Aquinas calls creation. For him, creation is an uncreated divine activity by which God is the primary and ultimate cause of all that is, at every moment that it is, the way it is. He contrasts this sort of activity with what he calls change. For him, this is what creatures do: influence one another, move things to different states of being. For Aquinas, this creaturely activity of change, which I will outline in a moment, is radically different from the act of creation. He says, quote, "For creation is not change, but the very dependency of the created act of being upon the principle from which it is produced. And thus, creation is a kind of relation, so that nothing prevents its being in the creature as its subject." In other words, creation is just this radical and fundamental relation of dependency of everything in both the physical and, for us, the spiritual cosmos on God. This dependency is immediate, simultaneous, and it extends to everything. That everything exists, that it exists as the kind of thing it is, that it has the powers it has, and at every moment it exercises those powers. God is creating as primary cause. And for Aquinas, creation is always creation ex nihilo. This radical relation by which God causes and sustains every creature in the entirety of their being and their doing. But just as God has not only given being to things when they first began to exist, and also causes being in them as long as they exist, conserving things in being, as we have shown, so also he has not merely granted operative powers to them, by means the powers by which they can act, when they were originally created, not just then, but he always causes these powers in things at every moment they are and that they act. Hence, if this divine influence were to cease, every operation would cease. Therefore, every operation of creatures is traced back to him as its cause. When I was a kid in Lines Point, Louisiana, the only thing I ever remember from my confirmation class, I was a pagan until I was about 19. Deacon Rodless Lala, was an old Cajun man. He told us, if God would stop thinking about you for one moment, you would cease to exist. He was a Thomist, that fellow. Now, you need to notice, this is crucial. Having a beginning in time is not relevant in any way in this regard for this radical relation of dependency. For the sake of argument, a temporally infinite cosmos would still be radically dependent upon God for its being, its acting, and its doing as primary sustaining cause. It would just be that this dependency relation of being created was temporally infinite. So, imagine if we could get in a time bubble or time machine, and we set the dial, gotta have a dial, to t equals 0. You know where we're going. We're going to the singularity, t equals 0. And through some kind of goggles, whatever, so we're watching the singularity take place. On Aquinas' account, we are no more watching creation than I am watching this moment right now. At t equals 0, the universe is no more or no less created than it is at any moment, at any and every moment. For St. Thomas, we would just be seeing the initial changes of beings in the universe, not its creation. You see the universe's creation from nothing. At every moment you see the universe. Now, we believe by faith, so says Aquinas, that the universe was created with time. Chris has talked about this in his book. But for Aquinas, if the universe was eternal in terms of temporality, it would make no difference. Imagine, and I get this from Steve Barr, by the way, it's not my example. Imagine as a thought experiment, we're going to do a couple more in this lecture, a lamp that from and for all eternity has been illuminating a sheet of paper. Now, from and for all eternity, the sheet of paper has radically depended upon the lamp for its being illuminated. Do you see? So time in this regard is not relevant. So if this is the case, what do creatures do? Well, it turns out just about everything, save for miracles. And we do everything but what Aquinas calls change. Change is a created creaturely activity by which one creature in its own causality influences another. The way St. Thomas thinks of this is it imparts to it a new state of being, a new property. From learning something to getting sunburned to moving, whatever. He thinks of it in very general terms. He thinks of it in terms of bringing new forms, which just means a state of being, out of the potential of the cosmos. He thinks everything in the universe, in the physical universe, is a composite of what he calls matter, think of it as potential, and form, determination. And for Aquinas, by the way, these are not just explanatory categories. He thinks they are actually causal. They explain because they are active forces in the ensemble that is nature. They are the deep reasons why things in nature produce the outcomes that they do in a coordinated ensemble of parts. So everything that goes on in the cosmos is one creature acting upon another. Change. So now how do we relate what God does to what we do? If I've been clear, some of you may be able to sniff this out. The best way to look at it is this primary causality is vertical. It exerts a simultaneous and continual influence upon what we might say is the horizontal, the realm of creatures and the realm of change and their causal relations. The first, primary causality, is the ultimate reason, the condition for the possibility for everything on the horizontal. Its being, its nature, its doing at every moment. For St. Thomas, these two causal lines, the primary and uncreated, the secondary and created, are so radically different. Nothing could be more radically different than the created and the uncreated. Are so radically different, they are not competing, even in principle. It is not possible for primary and secondary causes to compete because creatures have their causality because of the influence of primary causality. They are never competing. It is always the case, save for a miracle, and actually a miracle of only the highest kind of order. And that if nature does it, God doesn't do it. Or if God does it, nature doesn't do it. Only in the miracle, and the highest form of miracle, would we have something like the primary cause is on his own producing some effect. Aquinas puts it this way. It is also apparent that the same effect is not attributed to a natural, creaturely cause and to divine power in such a way that it is partly done by God and partly by the natural agent. Rather, it is wholly done by both, according to a different way. Just as the same effect is wholly attributed to the instrument and also wholly to the principal agent. So in Deuteronomy, the Shema, there's only one Lord, one God. You're supposed to keep this in a phylactery on your forehead. Bottle this one up and keep this one in a phylactery on your forehead. Because it seems to me this principle is so crucial, and any sort of meaningful faith-science dialogue cannot proceed unless it is grasped. So as primary constituting cause, God is more interior to creatures than creatures are to themselves. At every moment a creature is active, God is active. Now, you might even think of it this way. The more a creature is active, and therefore the more we can explain in terms of creatures, the more God is active. Not less, but the more. So now let's shift gears for a minute and talk about order and chance in terms of primary and secondary causality, the order of nature, God's providence, according to St. Thomas. Now, again, shocker, St. Thomas thinks that nature is a fundamentally ordered, intelligible, purposeful place. He thinks famously of the activities of creatures in terms of what he calls final causality. A good way to think of it is this. When any creature, up or down the scale, by the way, so even you and I as organisms, you might say, are even composed of subsets of other created realities. When I use the word creature, it just means a not God. Do you follow? An hydrogen molecule is just as much a creature as a frog in this regard. That when any creature, up or down the scale, regularly produces a meaningful outcome and does so typically and for the most part, St. Thomas takes that to be a manifestation of what it is or of its nature. Even if creatures can produce wildly disparate regular outcomes in different limiting conditions, it doesn't matter. You might think of the valence of elements in different conditions. As long as it's regular and patterned and therefore intelligible, Aquinas thinks this is a manifestation of the purposes in things. You might think of gametes. So imagine trying to figure out what gametes are without seeing how they regularly do what they do. It is perfectly sensible to say, well, we've got these two things. What are they gametes? What are they for? You might say, what is their purpose? Well, let's see what they do under regular conditions. Make babies. Do you see? So to talk about final causality and purpose in nature is really no more than to say things act in regular patterned ways as manifesting the kinds of things that they are. We always see these processes in nature, and that they are regular is part of what makes them intelligible. Now, since for Aquinas, God is the primary cause of the natures and activities of all beings, he's also the primary cause of their order and their purposefulness, and even the order and purpose of the ensemble that is nature, that has made up this coordinated ensemble of every creature in the cosmos. God is the primary cause of its order. And in being the primary cause of its order, God leaves what we might call a trace or a likeness of himself in both creatures and in the ensemble of their order. He puts it this way. Therefore, if he, God, has communicated his likeness as far as actual being is concerned, anything in reality, to other things, by virtue of the fact that he has brought things into being, it follows that he has communicated to them his likeness as far as acting is concerned. So the created things may also have their own actions, their own causality. So to detract from the perfection of creatures is to detract from the perfection of divine power. So for St. Thomas, it is utterly crucial that we get it right about creatures, because you get it wrong about creatures, you get it wrong about God. Because normally, in the order of nature, our only access to God is through creatures and the likeness that creatures are. Every creature on Aquinas' account is some sort of trace of divine perfection, and is a trace of divine perfection precisely as it's a cause, as an influencer in the cosmos. So if every creature, every single bit of created reality is a finite reflection or likeness of the increate, in every creature we can see a trace of the uncreated cause that we cannot directly see. For those who have eyes to see, everything in the cosmos is a sort of revelation. Creaturely reality for St. Thomas is fundamentally sacramental, a visible sign of the uncreated. Every creature is a carrier of divine meaning and encounter. Now, just like with the sacraments in the order of grace, the 7 of the church, it is fundamental that the created sign maintain its integrity. Otherwise, it cannot communicate the divine. You can't baptize without water. If all you got is 15W40, there's one thing you can't do with it, and that is baptize. The Eucharistic elements, the presence of Jesus, real and sacramental in the Eucharist, only maintains as long as the accidents of bread and wine do. When they are gone, divine presence is no longer. Do you understand? So whenever someone would spill the precious blood of Jesus on the floor in church by an accident, and it's then taken up with a cloth called a purificator, that purificator is diluted in water so that whatever wine is there is now thinned out, did you see? So that the accidents no longer remain. Now, it seems to me that if we're going to be serious about God, we have to be serious about creatures. And let me give a slap on the back to all of you in the sciences here just for one moment. It seems to me that the scientific vocation is so crucial and so wonderful because it attests to the integrity of creatures. To study creatures for their own sake, on their own terms, cannot detract from divine majesty if properly understood. It can only enhance it. The more one explains in terms of creatures, the more one attests to the uncreated power that is simultaneously and perpetually causing these creatures. That creatures are the sole object of empirical science and restrictively modeled along empirical and metric or mathematical lines. Quantifiable lines is no mark against modern empirical science. That it makes its explanation solely in references to this kind of model of nature is no mark against science. From my perspective, which if you've sniffed out, I belong to roughly the neo-scholastic tribe, that the modern scientific vocation, we might say, deals with only the empirical outside of creatures, is precisely as it should be. You have no access to the inside save through the outside. There's a way in which every creature is a sacrament of itself. We only get to the deep nature of creatures through their outside. In this regard, that modern science methodologically is uncompromisingly empirical and naturalistic. It attests to, we might say, the sacramental integrity of creatures, and therefore is an invaluable part of what I might call taking a tour of being, of the cosmos. For St. Thomas, one of the ways we return the cosmos to God is in insight and in knowledge. And the modern scientific project is an utterly crucial part of this. Now, what about chance? So if you've been following, purpose, or final causality, is that which happens for the most part, then chance would be what? That which happens for the least, or we'd rather say lesser part. So Aquinas sees chance in the following way. It's the result of two causal lines, things in their own nature, each with their own interior purpose and order, that intersect in such a way that they would impede each other's normal outcomes. They intersect and sort of frustrate what the normal outcomes would be. Think of why we call certain phenomenon in DNA replication during gestation mistakes. Do you see? There are these sort of the copying errors. There are these sort of exceptions to the rule. Now, don't make a mistake to think that therefore chances must be in this regard so rare. Depending on how you scale it, rarity is a relative judgment. So let's put this portion of the room, I will spare you guys, we'll put this portion of the room, no, I will include you. Take this portion of the room. We'll put it in a 12 by 12 cube, and we'll isolate in that cube all of the iterations in one moment, pick any moment in time, of cause and effect. Up or down the scale, right? On the macro scale of what you may be doing, what's going on in your body, what's going on in the realm, say, of chemistry and physics. And just for the sake of the thought experiment, let's just say there's 100 million iterations of cause and effect all the way up and down the scale at any given moment. That may be a liberal or a conservative estimate, I don't know. Let's say, if we were to model it in percentages, let's say that 5% of those events are, in Aquinas' account, these chance events where causal lines are sort of atypically intersecting. That's 5 million iterations of chance. So just because order may be more prevalent than chance in this regard, it's only relatively rare. And let's say my estimate was too conservative. Then our iteration, see what I mean? Chance events happen all of the time. Just in comparison to what we might call the regularity of nature, they are only relatively rare. Now, in St. Thomas's account, chance is not, he would say, a true cause, but he says it does something. He calls it an incidental cause. And it is not outside of God's providence, by the way. If God is the primary cause of all and all creatures, the chance that results from these creaturely intersections is just as much a part of his providence and causality, do you see? You might think of God as cause of everything, his causality extending in this kind of cone to any and everything that happens in creation. So chance is in no way whatsoever outside God's providence. It may seem that chance would be outside of the purposes of nature, and this is not quite true either on St. Thomas's account. It may be that in one instance, a thing can't be both, in particular, a purposeful manifestation of a nature, and by chance at the same time in the same way. However, it may be that a thing is by chance in particular, but in the greater order of secondary natural causes, it's in a greater framework or order of purpose. So Aquinas sees chance always in this greater order or framework of purpose. In fact, the idea of chance doesn't mean very much without a presupposition of a greater order or framework of purpose, regularity, and intelligibility. So I'm going to give you an example how he would see this work. And the science of this example is archaic. In many ways, we now just happens to be wrong. but it's illustrative in his own words how he would see these things working. So let's talk a minute about sex, actually, about Aquinas and generation. So he thinks generation normally happens by copulation, for the most part, in animals that he would see empirically. Now, say take a couple of cows or whatever. So in cow generation, all mammalian generation, his biology, we didn't know what really happened till the 19th century, by the way. So he doesn't know about ova, these kinds of things. He thinks of it in terms of semen. So he wouldn't just say that the bull and the semen of the bull is the cause of generation. He also thinks it depends on other simultaneous causes active in nature. The sun, in fact. What Aquinas thinks the sun does, of the many things the sun does regularly, it's essentially to heat semen and capacitate male generators to generate offspring. So imagine just a set of other simultaneous physical conditions that would be required. And for him, this is what happens for the most part. You see cows do their cow thing, and cow gestation time later, not quite 9 months, you get another cow. However, he does think that animals are generated in this kind of chance or spontaneous exceptional way by what he calls putrefaction. Take it to be rotting. So when you have a pile of rotting meat, what comes from it? Flies. From the mud, mollusk. From the dirt, worms. So he would want to explain, wait a minute, this screws them all up. He says, well, wait a minute. Aristotle screws up too. Well, how does this happen? Well, he has a certain mechanics for it. He says, well, okay, look. Everything in the cosmos is made out of basic elements. He has 4, these suppositional elements, earth, air, fire, and water, which have a certain potential when they're combined in certain organizations. And since what the sun does by its heat is capacitate generators, sometimes the causal lines of the sun interact with the potential of the elements, and these creatures are produced by chance for the least part, rarely, relatively speaking, spontaneously. But he says, generation by putrefaction is by chance when the particular outcome is considered. When the particular outcome is considered. But if you look at it in the greater framework of the causality of the sun, then it actually is intelligible and is part of the sun fulfilling its purpose, final causality. He puts it this way. But it must be noted that nothing prevents a process of generation from being a proper process when referred to one cause, and yet a chance affair when referred to another. If the process of generation of an animal generated from decay, putrefaction, is referred to the particular causes acting here below, it will found to be a matter of chance. But when referred to the power of the heavens, he means the sun, which is the universal power regulating generation and corruption in these lower bodies, it is not chance or accidental, but it's directly aimed at, because its goal, the sun's goal, is that all forms existing in the potentiality of matter should be brought to actuality. In other words, in his framework, the intracosmic body of the sun, what it does by its own nature, many, many things, one of these things is to causally capacitate generators by its heat. It's purposeful from the perspective of the sun and intelligible, and a chance affair in particular on lower orders. And look, and this is crucial, on St. Thomas's account, the universe would be less good without chance. Chance is part of the purpose of nature. He says, look, if everything in nature acted with perfect regularity, certain beings, certain forms would never come about. He's thinking of what? Flies, worms, mollusks, that sort of thing. So that all of the potential of the cosmos can be brought forth and be a likeness of divine perfection in some way, the cosmos would be less good without chance. Chance is a crucial part of both the order and the goodness of the cosmos. Now, one other way to think of these things interacting is to now apply our scale again of always, or for the most part, purpose, regularity. Well, depending on how one scales it in time, certain things that may seem irregular, not patterned, may become patterned. So when I was a kid, my godfather, Uncle Larry Richard, Crowley, Louisiana, he would slip me a little bit of money every Christmas, virtually every Christmas. Sometimes it was $20, good Christmas. Sometimes it was $5. Things were tough at the tire shop, I guess, I don't know. And every once in a while, he'd forget. Now, this happened roughly 365 days apart. It wasn't always quite on Christmas Eve, though it was usually. Well, I only was able to see the pattern because of a unity of consciousness and memory, correct? I was only able to see this occurrence over the course of time as ordered and a manifestation of purpose mixed with chance. Tough times at the tire shop, right? He just forgot, poor fellow. Now, what if we look at nature, according to a French historian, Ferdinand Braudel, the longue durée of nature and of cosmic and then of terrestrial natural history. If it happens in intervals of not 365 days, but 365,000 years, is it any less regular? Is it any less patterned? Is it any less for the most part? Do you see? It's all a matter of scale. And one of the great gifts of the modern scientific project is making us aware of this scale. Making us aware of this scale. You will see, and Dr. Dan is going to give us a lecture a little bit later, in which I'm pretty sure you're going to talk about Simon Conway Morris and the phenomenon of convergence in evolution. So if you look over the longue durée of life, the camera eye, so convergence is you have these similar structures that seem to come up again and again when one runs the tape of evolution. So the camera eye, for example, has evolved in vertebrates, us, cephalopods, squid, Cnidaria, certain kinds of jellyfish. And there seems to be no actual connection between. It's just that in certain ecological niches, to solve a problem, only a camera eye will do. I mean, it seems to me in this kind of dance of order and chance that this is how nature works on a Thomistic account. So where I'm from, lots of duck hunting. So let's say you're trying to take down a blue-winged teal. Little guy, super fast. So what you're going to do is use a shotgun. So you have this shell or cartridge full of powder and full of a bunch of different pellets. So let's say you're shooting, I don't know, you're particularly vicious. You're shooting like number 6s at the teals. The smaller the number, the bigger the BBs. So notice, I am, by order and purpose, trying to take down a duck. How do I do it? I shoot at it a random pattern, a random pattern of BBs. And it's precisely because it is random. It gives me a chance of producing the outcome. Now notice, all I want is for one to hit. Trust me, just one. If you've ever eaten ducks and not gotten them all out, it's a nightmare. I just want one to hit. But chance is a function of achieving that purpose and that order. Aristotle had once famously talked about nature as, quote, a doctor who doctored itself. What he means is this. He thinks of medicine as what he would call a techne, an art, a craft, a skill. And that nature somehow seemed to have this in itself, and it was like a doctor caring for itself, right, by his skill. However, let's take that analogy a little bit further, probably in a direction Aristotle wouldn't have liked. Think of medicine and of any techne, art, craft, or skill. Why do we come up with medicine as a craft? It's to solve a problem, right? How to inculcate or maintain or restore health in a body, correct? And whatever the appropriate means are, given the situation, we try to figure out those means and then use those means. Anybody who knows physicians, even with the acquired knowledge of the medical art, sometimes health is a moving target. And one of the things physicians are, they are problem solvers. They have the end in mind, but conditions on the ground, this body, with its condition, in its history, will dictate the solution. Do you see? Will dictate the solution. It seems to me that nature works this way, maybe in a Thomistic framework. There are certain problems, possibly, only a camera eye will do. Only a camera eye will do. So, to close, in this Thomistic framework, you see, one, the activity of God and the activity of creatures as non-competing, and the primary as the deep reason for the secondary. And so there's never a competition in principle. And that to explain nature on its own terms, not only is there nothing to fear or nothing threatening, this is precisely what we should be doing if we live in a sacramental cosmos. I will leave the last word to my one of my favorite Thomistic philosophers who was taken from us too early, Charles de Connick. And this is one of the very end of a certain section of his work called The Cosmos. He wrote it in 1936. And he puts it this way. Let us say there are two ways in which scholastics, and I will say Catholics, Christians, religious people, have sought to honor the Creator. The one consists in diminishing as much as possible the causality of the creature. That is the, quote, idea in the back of the mind of those authors, which are called creationists. They want us to think that it takes a special creative act for the production of each natural and biological species, as is the case with angelic species and human forms. He means the human soul. They deny the scientist the right to derive biological species to one from the other. The other extreme is found the Thomistic tendency, inspired by St. Augustine, which enriches as much as possible the causality of the creature, not with the goal of eliminating creative intervention, but in order to increase it. For the creative power envisaged from the side of the effect is most profoundly at work where created causes are most causes. The more a creature is capable of acting, the more it manifests the power of its ultimate cause, for God is the cause of all causality. From this point of view, He is much more profoundly cause of our free acts than we are ourselves. Remember, human freedom, the spontaneity of the cosmos, you might say a different kind of freedom, which we have to bear the burden of, us and the cosmos, is a creature and therefore caused by God. If we have a dread of spirit, if we have the dread of spirit, which animates creationism, this is because it is not creationist enough. In the final instance, it is a form of occasionalism. Thank you for listening.